My name is Simon Ellis. I have been around supply chains for about 36 years. So I'm a supply chain operations guy. I'm not an IT guy. I'm not a technology person. So for me, I think about this always through the lens of the operations, through the lens of the supply chain. So you'll see in my title, it says Manufacturing and Energy Insights and Worldwide Supply Chain Strategies. I look at supply chains across the full breadth of industries, right? So I know there's a lot of life sciences people here today. There's a lot of healthcare folks. Maybe there's even some retail folks as well. So I'll talk generally about supply chains for the next 30 minutes or so, but I will focus on specifically some sub-segments of industry because I know there's interest in some of those here in the audience here today. So I've been, it's interesting. So one of the things that Scott said pretty early on was data. I think I counted. I think you mentioned data like 22 times. And I always used to get asked. So I go to a lot of conferences. I didn't go to some conferences for 2-3 years. I can't remember why. And people always used to ask me, they said, Simon, what is it that you think will differentiate the best supply chains of the future from those that are just ordinary? And I worked in industry for a couple of decades before I joined IDC. I ran a factory. I spent time in procurement. I was a logistician. Spent a lot of time as a supply chain planner. And when I used to get asked that, my answer was, it's not going to be the supply chain planning tool you use. It's not going to be the transportation management tool you use. It's going to be how well you use data, right? And now this was, 7, 8, 9, 10 years ago, but it was pretty clear to me at that point that those companies, those operational organizations, those supply chains that used data better were going to outperform those that did not. And so when I joined IDC back in 2016, it was sort of serendipitous, I suppose, that the middle initial in the acronym stands for DATA, International Data Corporation. So I've spent a lot of time in the last 16 years thinking about the role for data, how important it is, how much it can drive better outcomes. And as I go through some of the slides here this morning, I will try to touch on that. Excuse me, I'm dealing with a bit of a cough. I'll try not to hack my way through the next 25 minutes. This idea of the importance of data, I think, informs so much of what we're thinking about these days in the supply chain. As I noted, I've been around supply chains for 3.5 decades, and I think it's really only been in the last 2 or 3 years that I think folks have fully realized the importance of the supply chain. It's become part of the every man, every person lexicon. I think folks now understand more about supply chains probably than they ever did before, maybe more than they want to know. But certainly, we've seen an enormous increase in the interest in supply chains and in the focus on supply chain technology and the use of data in the supply chain. So so I thought it might be interesting here today to share with you some data from from data from a recent supply chain survey. This was a global survey that was in the field in March. So the data is brand new, and I'm gonna take you on a sort of a quick journey through some of the things that we've learned, and some of the things that were perhaps surprising, and then some of the things that were perhaps not surprising. So I'm going to talk a little bit about supply chain disruptions. We're still dealing with them. Maybe it's not so much pandemic stuff now. Perhaps it's a bit more about inflation, or economic circumstances, or military conflicts in parts of the world that affect the supply chain in both predictable and unpredictable ways. Going to talk a little bit about kind of executive priorities, right? cost pressures, labor markets. And the labor market's changed a bit actually in the last 6 months, and I'll touch on that somewhat. Certainly things like scalable analytics, better integration, this notion of connective tissue that I'll touch on later. Migration to the cloud. Scott had artificial intelligence as the last step in his 1978 to 2023, I think was the duration. And so what is the role for these kinds of capabilities? And so we'll talk a little bit about that. Challenges, right? Lack of collaborations it's funny. I mean, I've been working with manufacturers, working with supply chain organizations around collaboration for a distressingly long time, yet it still remains a challenge for so many. So I'll show you what some of the data says around collaboration. This notion of the importance of speed, being able to do things more quickly. I don't know, I dusted off the old people running away from the bear joke a few weeks ago. You don't have to outrun the bear, you just have to outrun the other guy trying to outrun the bear. And so I think a lot about that. It's a goofy old joke, right? But I think a lot about that in the context of speed and being able to be fast to alternatives. And then how important is new technology and cloud and artificial intelligence, and I've got some points later on that I'll touch on there as well. And then lastly, I think, is this idea of kind of enterprise vision, right? So, what are our priorities? Is it sustainability, for example? I don't think anybody's mentioned that yet this morning, but how important are things like sustainability? How important are things like orchestration and connectivity, and how do we think about them in the context of how companies think about their operations and how they think about supply chains? So disruptions. It's funny. I never really liked the term new normal. There's a few terms I dislike. I was coming to the hotel yesterday, and this guy in front of me in his car had game changer bumper sticker. That's another phrase I really hate. Everything's a game changer, right? So I won't use that term here today, I don't think. But this idea of sort of the new normal, and I don't know, I started using the term next to normal. Maybe it's a difference without a distinction without a difference. But this idea that there is no normal anymore, it's just a bunch of different phases you go through that are different than the one before, and the one after will be different than this. And so I think a lot about this sort of notion of disruption. So we asked in the survey, and it was a survey of about 1,500 organizations across different industries, across different regions, and asked them, what are the things that are irritating your operations today? What are the things that are problematic for you today? And it's quite interesting because this is a survey we do every year. So we did it in March of 2022 as well. Back then, the manifestations of disruption were almost all around delays or supplier unreliability or demand volatility. And so you still see some of that, but what I think has, for many companies, kind of superseded those because they are better than they were, probably not fully back to where they should be or need to be, but they're better than they were. But I think what we've seen more is this idea that costs have gotten out of control, right? That these companies have been dealing with inflation now for 12 months, 18 months. And so whether it's supply costs, supply input costs, or transportation costs, that's been a big issue for many companies, for many supply chains. Those are the things that have sort of become, sort of the list of issues kind of, it's dynamic, right? It changes over time, I think. And I think where we are at the moment, and next year this time it could be different again, but I think where we are at the moment is it's more about cost necessarily than availability. And it's interesting. So I talk to lots and lots of supply chain organizations, lots and lots of end user organizations, And I was having a conversation with a chief procurement officer for a small pharmaceutical company about 6 months ago. And she was talking about how they had to change their approach to procurement as a consequence of the pandemic, but they are now starting to move back to where they used to be. And so the difference was, historically, when engaging in a procurement effort, they try to negotiate to the best possible price. I mean, that's how procurement organizations have worked forever. But when supply became so significantly constrained in many cases, she said they kind of abandoned that effort, and it was now more about trying to get what they needed almost for any price. And so the sort of the cost arbitrage process that they had used didn't work so well when supply was so constrained. Yet as constraints have eased, they're going to go back to that, because for them, supplier costs is a huge problem, and they're struggling either to maintain prices to consumers or to B2B, or they're taking price increases. So I thought, at least for me, I thought that was kind of interesting in the context of sort of the big problem has shifted slightly. I think it still becomes a balance of the two for most companies, but I think this idea of prices and inflation, at least for now, has superseded that of availability. And you see that here, right? So this is the blue line is within the next year. The green line, I guess, is in 3 years. So what are the priorities, right? And it's sort of, at least from my perspective, it's sort of the yin and yang of, it's about how do I find ways to be more efficient, but also how do I make sure that I continue to be resilient. That same chief procurement officer that I was talking to, that I noted before, one of the things she said to me, which kind of stuck, was, she said, if we buy all of what we need of something from a single supplier in a single country, we will get a best price. But it's not going to be particularly resilient. If that supplier has a problem, we have a problem. She said, or we can buy 1/5, I've used 1/5 just as an example, maybe it's a quarter or a sixth, but we can buy 1/5 of what we need from 5 suppliers in 5 countries. That will be more resilient. We will be more resilient to disruptions, but we're gonna net pay more. And so she said, we have to kind of make this, we have to reconcile the two, right? We have to understand that there is this, I tended to use the word tension, maybe it's not tension, maybe it's more a tug between efficiency and resiliency, right? How do I make sure that my supply chain is resilient and that I can respond and my time to recovery is shorter, but at the same time, how do I make sure that I am reducing costs and eliminating waste and driving efficiency? And so it's a tension, I think, that we see in a number of companies across just about all industries. Thought it might be interesting, again, forgive me, I'm a supply chain geek, right? I mean, I live and love this stuff, and so when somebody talks about warehouse and inventory management and optimization, I'm like, oh, this is great stuff. And so, what do companies say? Again, 12 months and 3 years. We did a chief supply chain officer survey back in the fall of last year, so the data's a little bit older. But when we asked both chief supply chain officers and chief procurement officers what their top priorities were, it was better management of inventory. And that, by the way, was particularly true for chief supply chain officers of healthcare and life sciences companies, was how do we do a better job of managing inventory? How do we get better performance out of industry? How do we write less stuff off? That was, for most of them, their number one priority for 2023. Supply planning, again, I think back to that notion of how do I think about my supply network? How do I think about the degree to which I want to diversify? There's been a lot of discussion lately about nearshoring. I tend to be a nearshoring skeptic. I think it's a red herring. I think it's always a red herring, because when people talk about made in America, no. It's assembled in America, right? The stuff is still coming from all over the world. And so I think supply planning is certainly something that we're seeing as a higher priority for companies to make sure they have the right tools that they can better orchestrate their supply chain. And I'll touch on supply chain orchestration in a bit. So I started out by talking about disruptions. To me, disruptions and supply chain risk are kind of flip sides of the same coin. And so this is a question that we always ask, which is, what are you doing to better manage risk in your organization? It's almost always visibility, number one. There have been times where agility kind of leapfrog visibility, but it's always those two things, because the way, at least that I think about supply chain resiliency, is that I gotta see it, I've gotta have the tools necessary to, right? So see it means data. I've gotta have the tools necessary to analyze it, and I have to be able to do something about it. And one of the examples I have often used, as I was preparing my notes for the speech, I was like, well, it was last year, but it actually wasn't last year, it was the year before last, when the Ever Given got itself wedged across the Suez Canal. I don't know how many companies, how many folks here, whether their supply chains were affected by that. I certainly talked to dozens of companies in the days and weeks after that, just to kind of get a sense as to the impact. And I had two conversations that were sort of 180 degrees different, right? One was with a company who they knew within hours, maybe even within minutes, what stuff they had on that ship. They knew what stuff was on ships that were now going to be backed up. They knew what production they were anticipating from the parts of the world that would have to go through the Suez Canal. And so they were very quickly able to assess the potential impact and make alternative plans. Another company that I spoke with didn't know any of that. They even days and weeks on, they still didn't really know what the impact was, and so they were slow to make the kinds of remediations necessary to try to minimize the impact. And so to me, that's why I use the two guys running away from the bear a joke, because in that case, the first company, they didn't have to be instantaneously fast. They just had to be faster than their competition. And so they were able to minimize the impact. And so from a risk management perspective, they saw it, they were able to analyze it, and they were able to take actions, because when something like that happens, the alternatives available to companies will inevitably be limited, and the companies that can get there faster will find the impact minimal or minimized. The companies that get there slower will find the impact much larger. So just at least from my perspective, sort of an interesting real world example where resilience, visibility, agility does make a difference. So the other thing that I ask the respondents to these surveys is, what are the problems that you have today? What are the gaps that you have in your supply chain and your operations that, if you don't fix them, will be most problematic for you in the future? And again, blue line 12 months, green line 3 years. it's about that example from before, right? It's about, having the visibility, having the agility necessary so that I can respond quickly, so that I can react to things that happen effectively. And it doesn't have to be black swan events, right? It can be operational disruptions. It could be, a piece of machinery in a factory's failed and the line's down for 2 days, right? So it's about sort of having that visibility and that agility, and what is necessary for that, right? Is it about having the right data? Is it about having the right data in the right place? Is it about having the data in one system that can connect easily to another system? So there's all sorts of nuance, I think, to what a lack of visibility and lack of agility might mean. But I do think for so many companies, for so many supply chains, that's at the heart of where they struggle. They aren't able to easily or effectively move from I see it to I can act on it effectively. And that, I think, is ultimately the biggest thing that supply chains should work on and should be investing in over the next decade. Collaboration, certainly in this particular case, it's with external suppliers and/or customers. We did a different survey the middle of last year where we asked companies about how they share documents with their suppliers, and 75% of them are still sending paper documents, or they may be digitizing documents, but then they're sending the digital analog. Yeah, or they're sending a digital version of the document. And so I still think of that as kind of paper-based thinking, but massive amount of paper-based thinking still in terms of how companies are collaborating with external suppliers or with customers. And it's, on some level, it's sort of hard to believe that that's where we are still in 2023, when there are so many really good tools available. InterSystems has many of them to make this process more efficient, to make this process more effective, to make this process more kind of two-way collaborative. I think that was kind of interesting. I just wanted to make the point here. Purple is life sciences, green is retail, and blue is manufacturing. That these problems occur. They're almost regardless of industry. The prior speaker noted that many of these issues are not unique to one particular industry. They are common across many, and so we see that certainly in terms of the ability to be resilient, the lack of collaboration. We see, again, common across industries, similar kinds of challenges, similar kinds of problems, and so it's not unique to one particular subsegment of one industry or another. This is just for supply chain planning. So what I did was I went and looked at all of the vendors that offer solutions in various segments, right? Starting with supply chain orchestration, multi-enterprise supply chain networks, all the way through to connectivity and analytics and the SIs. It's a massive cauldron of companies, right? There's lots and lots of different vendors, and this is probably only scratching the surface. This is just the big ones. There are a whole long tail of small ones. So I own the supply chain IT forecasting process at IDC, where we go out and we talk to lots and lots of different vendors and lots of different companies to try to get a feel for what supply chain IT spending is going to be, how much of it is cloud, and how much of it remains kind of legacy on-prem. And there is a distressingly large percentage of spending still in legacy on-prem. And so you have companies that are dealing with IT environments to support supply chain that are mixed in terms of cloud versus on-prem, certainly mixed in terms of different kinds of vendors. And it's the classic IT spaghetti chart from 10 years ago, right? And so how do we start to tie all this stuff together? Because from the prior slide where I talked about the sort of the number one gap being lack of visibility and agility to respond quickly to events. This is part of the problem, right? The fact that there are so many different vendors, that companies have so many different tools, and those tools don't always talk well together. I'm not a data fabric or a data lake. I don't know. I chuckled at the gentleman's comment from before because one of my colleagues at IEC refers to data lakes as data bogs. I guess that's a bit like a swamp, but I'm certainly not an expert there. But from an operational supply chain perspective, how do we start to make sense of all this? How do we start to tie these things together? And that was why I used this notion in doing some work with InterSystems around this idea of connective tissue. I didn't actually intend it to be the term that got used, but because I thought it was a bit sort of gristly. But it ended up being probably a not unreasonable way of thinking about this, right? Getting better integration, being able to do real-time synchronized planning across operations and across supply chains, connecting and contributing to better decision making. And so this idea of a data platform that can allow you to better tie these things together. And we've talked about supply chain control towers for a long time. It's another of those terms I don't like and I try not to use, which is why I tend to call it more supply chain orchestration. But how do we begin to tie these things together to not only make better decisions, but to make faster and more timely decisions, to be faster and quicker than my competitors so I can get the right answer more quickly and get a better outcome. And so, at least for me, from my perspective, this idea of connective tissue, this idea of supply chain orchestration and being able to tie these things together is a really powerful idea. And I think in many ways, it's the piece of the supply chain that's been missing, that if we can get there, because companies are not going to move to a single supply chain planning platform anytime soon. They're not going to move to a single supply chain fulfillment and execution platform anytime soon. And so, how do we get the benefits of those realized more quickly? I think it's through this idea of having these data platforms, of having these connective tissue platforms. I thought it might be interesting just to sort of note those companies who have started to move to these platforms, those companies who have been more aggressive about adopting cloud. And I don't mean taking an on-prem application that was sitting on my data center and moving it to somebody else's data center. I mean moving to true multi-enterprise SaaS cloud. You can see the kinds of benefits. The video that Scott ran before from you guys. One of you talked about being able to be on the most current version of things all the time and not having to have your people worry about upgrades and updates. And we see that as well, right? We see we're always on the most recent version of an application, right? We have the better features, the better functionality available to us immediately. And oh, by the way, just as an ancillary benefit, it improves overall supply chain visibility. So cloud is clearly the future for supply chain. It's clearly the future for these data platforms. It's just going to take a little while to get there. How important are technologies and different kinds of technologies? I think you can see. There's a bit of bright, shiny object-ness about AI at the moment. I kind of remember 6 or 7 years ago where blockchain was the big thing, and everyone was blockchain this and blockchain that, and okay, that didn't work out so great. I think that's probably not going to happen here. I do actually think that AI has a major transformative effect on the supply chain. But we'll have to see, right? But certainly at the moment, we're seeing that as a top priority for companies. I thought it would be interesting as I kind of close out here, and I'm just gonna, in the interest of time, I'm just gonna scroll through this. One of the other studies that we've done for supply chain and operations is and this was done early last year, so it's about a year old. We've looked at the and we ask companies to self-assess, right? So we've looked at the level of maturity of supply chain digital transformation, and ask companies to kind of rate where they are. I'm not going to take the time to go through the detailed definitions of the 5 steps, other than to sort of suggest that steps 1 and 2 are companies that are fairly immature in their supply chain transformation journey. 4 and 5 are companies that are more mature in their supply chain journey. And I think it's interesting that, okay, there are 22% of companies that are quite advanced in terms of their efforts, but there are 78% that are not, right? And so this is still an aspirational journey in supply chain for many companies. It is still an opportunity. And I think there's a lot of work, there's a lot of time still to be spent as companies move, which they inevitably will have to, I think, as they inevitably move from being less mature to more mature. And I think it's fair to ask, so what? Why should I care? And I think this is why. So this is yet another study that we've done at IDC, where we look at it's around 3,000 global manufacturers and pharmaceutical and retail companies. We make a judgment. It's a ton of effort, but we make a judgment based on available information and what we know about the companies. We make a judgment about their level of digital maturity in supply chain, and we then correlate that to profit and revenue. And what we find is that there is a significant difference. So companies that we judge to be more mature in their transformation efforts tend on average to outperform those that are not significantly in terms of both profits and revenues. Now, I can't say causation, so I do use the word correlation intentionally, but to me this is a massive that's why. This is a massive so what, right? That's why, because companies that invest in these kinds of technologies are outperforming those that do not. We will see whether this continues. We've only done it out through the end of 2021. We will later this year do it for 2022, and later in 2024 we'll do it for 2023. You get the idea. But I don't expect that this will change. I think we will continue to see a significant positive correlation between business performance and level of digital maturity, level of transformation. So as I close here, and in the interest of time, I'm going to just sort of do all the builds. I think, as I think about both the past of supply chains informing the future, what are the things that we're going to need to pay attention to, right? One is data, right? Data through analytics to action. The second one is, how can we make sure that we are resilient both to internal and external disruptions? We've focused a lot over the last few years on the external ones, but there are internal disruptions as well. I think how do we figure out how to be collaborative at scale, right? We can focus on the top suppliers, we can focus on the top customers, but is that enough? Or should we be able to, or should we be aspiring to being collaborative at scale? Only because I like the word prescient, I've put it in the deck, but be predictive, be prescient where possible, but understand that some events simply aren't predictable, and so we need to be fast where possible. The example of the Suez Canal, right? Nobody predicted that, nobody could predict that. So if you can't predict something, make sure you're at least fast, make sure you're at least responding quickly. And then excuse me. And if you can react fast enough, it almost looks like you were able to predict it. So that's kind of at least from an IDC perspective. Do I have a no? Okay, I guess that's it. That's it from an IDC perspective. I hope you found it interesting. Hope you found at least some of it insightful. I always, at least from my perspective, I always try to if I have data, I at least have some sense of this supports a view or this supports an opinion. But this is how we see the supply chain. This is how we expect to see the supply chain over the next 3 or 4 years. And I thank you for your time, and I thank you for your attention.